Greetings and welcome to the CCOF Foundation webinar on the requirements for farms that must fully comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Thanks for being here with us today. We are delighted to have Kaylee Fire-Iozol and Dave Runston from Community Alliance with Family Farmers with us again today for the second installment of our webinar series for organic professionals on the Food Safety Modernization Act. In this webinar, Kaylee and Dave will review part of the requirements for organic farms that must comply fully with the FSMA. And just to note, today's webinar is supported through a USDA National Institute for Food and Agriculture Western SARE grant. If you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't hear or can't see, please call our office for support. The number is 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. My name is Megan Donovan and I will be your host today. I'm a program specialist at the CCOF Foundation. The CCOF Foundation advances organic agriculture for a healthy world through education and hardship grants, technical assistance, and consumer education. Also to note, my colleague Jacob Guth will also be online with us today. Jacob is CCOF's Food Safety Program Manager, and prior to his current role, he worked in CCOF's Organic Certification Department for many years. Jacob will be online to answer questions related to organic certification and third-party food safety audits, so you may hear him jump in from time to time. Before we get started with the main presentation, I want to review a few housekeeping items. We're happy to announce that this live webinar broadcast has been approved for Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Units, as well as CCOF Organic Inspector Continuing Education Units. To receive credit for attending the webinar, include your full name, and if you're a Certified Crop Advisor, your CCA number. In the evaluation form at the end of the webinar, and you must attend the entire webinar to receive credit. I also wanted to let you know how you can participate in today's web event. We're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar attendee interface, which is made up of two parts. The viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything the presenter will share on their screen, and the control panel on the right. Within the control panel is how you can participate in today's event, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. By clicking the orange arrow, you can open and close your control panel. From the view menu, you can also set the control panel not to auto-hide when inactive if you prefer to keep it always open. The audio pane provides audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. If you prefer, you can join the audio via telephone by selecting phone call, and the dial-in information will be displayed. During the presentation, you can send questions to our webinar staff through the questions pane. Simply type in your question and click send. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers, and we will answer as many questions as we have time for. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email with a link to view a recording of today's event, along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides. So we want to encourage you to test out the questions pane and write in. Let us know where you're calling in from today, as well as whether you attended the first webinar in the series FSMA 101. And just to let you know, today's webinar is building off what we covered in that first webinar. So if you didn't attend FSMA 101, we encourage you to check it out on the CCOF website. The link's there, and we'll also send out a link after the webinar so you can watch it then. And have a good crowd in the audience today, which is great. And we will try to get to as many questions as comments as possible. And we wanted to encourage you, if we don't get to your specific question, to follow up with us after the webinar, and we'll provide contact information for people to do that. So thanks again for attending today. And without further ado, I will introduce our speakers from Community Alliance of Family Farmers. Kaylee Feiereisel serves as CAFF Food Safety Specialist. She provides food safety technical assistance to farmers as they further develop their practices to meet new requirements. In addition to her background in diversified vegetable production, Kaylee recently studied food safety, local food systems, and food and agriculture policy while completing her graduate degree in public health and nutrition from the University of California, Berkeley. Dave Runston serves as CAFF's policy director. He directs CAFF policy work as well as food safety and water stewardship outreach. Dave is an agricultural economist who conducted research on topics such as contract agriculture in Mexico, fair trade coffee in Oaxaca, and regional competitiveness of the produce industry. So Dave and Kaylee, thanks for being here this afternoon, and I'll pass the presentation on to you. So I think we're having a little trouble hearing you. If you happen to be on mute.
Thanks, Megan. I think it's working now.
Okay, great.
Thank you for getting us started on all of that. And Dave and I are looking forward to going through this with our attendees today. Thanks for taking the time to join us. So this is Food Safety, FSMA, and NOP Part 2. So this is the second, as Megan said, in a 3-part webinar series. And just as Megan noted, this is funded through a USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture grant through the Western SARE program. So just a disclaimer that this is any opinions, findings, or recommendations in our webinar today are those of CAFF, and we do not necessarily reflect the view of the USDA. Okay, so on September 11th, we did the first part of the webinar number 1 of this 3-part series. And you can find the link to it down there at the bottom, and you'll have a copy of these slides emailed out, and I'm sure that they're available on the websites too. So you can go and reference this first webinar. If you didn't join us on September 11th and you're here today, there might be some areas where you have additional questions because these are kind of building on each other. So hopefully you can still stick with us, but if you have questions, I would highly recommend checking out this first webinar because it's really a foundational webinar that we build upon today. Okay, and then today we're talking about what are some of the main categories and actions and practices farms need to put in place if they are fully subject to the new Food Safety Modernization Act, and how those requirements intersect with National Organic Program requirements and how they can coexist together, that they do not conflict against one another. And then lastly, in January 2011, we will have our 3rd webinar, which we will cover the topics that we don't cover today, which are going to be manure and compost, animals, wild and domestic animals, and then water. And part of the reason for that is the water requirements for FSMA for fully covered farms are not currently set. The FDA is re-reviewing what the requirements are going to be, so those may change this fall or early winter, and we're hoping to have more clarity on that by mid-January so we can give you an updated assessment and information about how it stands. And then lastly, just a note here that along with these webinars, we also are developing a series of fact sheets, and we updated our farmer's guide, which is a PDF resource, and there are some print copies available at CCOF and at CAFF, and whenever we're out at conferences or at trainings in person, we have copies of these resources available, but they're also available electronically and dive deeper into these topics, and are also just another tangible resource than something written that explains all of this, not just our verbal explanation. Okay, so just to recap, this webinar is for fully subject farms under FSMA. So farms that are fully subject to the entire law are farms that in the last 3 years, their gross sales from the farm were greater than $500,000, and that's adjusted into 2011 dollars. So that's one type of farm category that is fully subject to FSMA. So that even applies to farms that sell directly to customers at farmers markets and through a community supported agriculture program or something like that. If they make over $500,000 in adjusted dollars, they still are subject to the whole law. There's no exemption for them. Alternatively, some farms may sell less than $500,000 in sales, but they don't sell more than 50% to a qualified end user. So just a recap from the first webinar, a qualified end user is essentially sales directly to a customer. So that can be sales at a farmer's market, sales through a CSA, sales at a farm stand, selling directly to a restaurant or directly to one grocery store. Those are different ways that a farm can count those as qualified end user sales. So an example of a farm in this category would be, say you're a strawberry grower and you grow only strawberries and you grow $75,000 worth, you gross $75,000 worth of strawberry sales each year, but you sell all of them to a broker and they go onto the wholesale market and they get sold who knows where. Those are sales that don't count for the qualified end user category. So even though that farm is far below $500,000, they don't sell at least half of that $75,000 to a qualified end user. So they need to be in compliance with the entire Food Safety Modernization Act law. If this is fast and a lot, I encourage you to stick with us as we move forward, but we go over this in more in depth and slowly in the first webinar with lots of examples. Okay, so fully subject farms under FSMA. These are the main categories where the law has certain practices or requirements that farms need to do. Today we will cover the worker training qualifications category, the worker health and hygiene, buildings, equipment, tools, and sanitation, harvest and post-harvest, and record keeping. Again, we'll cover the red categories in January.
I might say that this is kind of a summary, right? Because the PSA thing is a lot more detail.
And Dave wanted me to add here that we are giving more of a summary of these categories. We're not going through every last nitpicky detail through each and every category. I'll talk about here in a minute a training that is called the PSA training that really goes into all of these specifics in an 8-hour training in one day. So this is just giving you a higher level overview of all of these categories. And then if you're a fully subject farm, you would need further time spent on the specific details. But if we did that right now today, that wouldn't be applicable to your first, if you're first learning about this subject, it would be more helpful to give a higher view that we're going to go over today. And then just one last detail is kind of on this introductory section. So FSMA, remember, doesn't require fully covered farms to have a farm food safety plan. So the law doesn't require it, but CAFF and CCOF and UC Extension and a lot of folks that help farmers out with food safety work all highly recommend that farms do it, because having a written document, it doesn't need to be super complex. It is adjusted and just a reflection of the farm. So a really large, really complex farm might have a pretty complicated food safety plan, but smaller farms, it wouldn't necessarily, they could have a small but perfectly sufficient food safety plan. And we have some templates there at that URL, and there's plenty of other resources out there that help farmers create their food safety plans either electronically or in templates that they can print out and write on. And then FSMA does not require farms to have to get a third-party food safety audit. However, distributors and other buyers are required to meet something called the supplier verification part of their FSMA requirements. And the law doesn't explicitly say how buyers can meet that requirement, but oftentimes buyers ask their suppliers to get a third-party food safety audit. So that's where there can be a little bit of confusion, because a farm would say, I'm not required to get a third-party audit, but a buyer would say, I need to verify my suppliers, and this is how I'm doing it. So that's an area where there can be some disagreement, and we can talk more about that if attendees have specific questions. And then this is just a recap of the timeline. So farms are required to be in compliance based off of their gross sales range that they fall under on the left-hand column there. And then the FSMA compliance dates are tiered starting in January 2018. And then, as we mentioned before, actually I don't know if in September the FDA announcement had come out yet, but in September, the FDA announced that inspections for FSMA will not begin until 2019. So the farms that potentially could have got inspected in 2018, these farms that are over 500,000 in sales, they will not be able to be inspected until 2019, because across the country, the FDA pushed back inspections a year. So that's an interesting, or it's just a new announcement that we heard just a month or two ago. And then again, the water compliance dates are longer. Those are pushed out further and ahead because they're still trying to finalize what farms need to do for water. And then with FSMA and organic, there is a good bit of overlap, and in general, just a farm that's organically certified is already used to keeping records and documenting their systems and verifying their inputs, things like this. And that is going to help a farm get into food safety compliance too. Also, growers need to know, organic growers, that there's specific wording in the regulation that says that the regulation does not require covered farms to take measures to exclude animals from outdoor growing areas or to destroy animal habitat or otherwise clear farm borders around outdoor growing areas or drainages. So this is really important, because with your organic certification, it's important that you're protecting natural resources and conservation and biodiversity, and the Food Safety Modernization Act says this here, that you, by doing natural resource conservation, that's okay. FSMA does not ban you from doing that. Both regulations work in concert with each other, and farmers should never say, I'm getting rid of my hedgerows or my riparian areas because FSMA tells me I have to. That's not correct. FSMA does not require farmers to do that. And then, like I just said, an organic farmer is already most of the way there, or at least started on the way to becoming in compliance with food safety regulations. They will probably need to do some additional record keeping and training for worker health and hygiene. And then with the water, a certain number of water tests and water monitoring will need to happen. Okay, so the first category we're at, now that we're through all that intro information, is worker training and qualifications. In FSMA, worker training requirements are as follows. So the NOP has no worker training requirements. So some new areas to consider are that FSMA requires all farm personnel to be adequately trained upon hire and at least once annually. So if a farm isn't keeping track of training their employees upon hire, which could simply be a sheet where the employee writes their name and then signs their name and dates their name after they get trained on X, Y, Z topics, then that would fulfill having a record that shows that that employee has been trained on the topics they need to. For number 2, all farm personnel have to have adequate training, education, or experience for their job duties. Number 3, training must be done in a way that is easily understood by trainees. So this is important if there's non-English speakers working at a farm. There needs to be training provided to them in their native language, and signs posted for hand washing and other signs that apply to them need to be posted in their language. Number 4, training must be repeated if personnel fail to meet FSMA requirements. An example of this could be all employees on the farm will need to be trained on how important hand washing is. And say you have a toilet situation where it's like a porta potty and then there's sinks outside of the porta potty where you wash your hands. And a field supervisor or somebody on the harvest crew notices that a certain employee goes out of the bathroom and walks right by the hand washing area, does not wash their hands, and heads back to the field. That would be an observation of somebody failing to meet their training and the requirements they need to do with hand washing. And hopefully a crew foreman or somebody responsible party would see that and be able to correct that action as it happened and explain to the employee the importance of hand washing and make sure that they go and wash their hands before getting back into the field. And you would need to document that on X day that employee was retrained on the topics. And then number 5, I already mentioned this, but you need to have some sort of record that has the names of those trained and what they were trained on and the date of the training. So there's a lot of training that needs to happen, and what topics should the training cover is an important question. All employees on the farm should be trained on food hygiene principles and food safety, the importance of personal hygiene and illness signs that may cause someone to contaminate produce or a food contact surface. And the third thing is that the standards established by the FDA and the produce rule are applicable to the employee's job. This is more of on management or those responsible at the farm need to make sure that people that are qualified for the job they're doing are working that job. So if you just have employees that are doing irrigation or cultivation and not actually harvesting crops, you could technically just train them on these categories and that would be sufficient for them. But if you also have training or employees that work on harvest, they need to be trained additionally on when to not harvest produce because it may be contaminated. For example, it might have bird poop or some other feces on it or contamination. Workers also need to be trained on not harvesting dropped covered produce. And Dave's going to talk more about that topic and what dropped produce means in our harvest section. So we'll talk more about that then. But also employees need to inspect harvest containers to make sure they're clean and not a source of contamination. And then if they do see a problem during harvest, they need to report it to a supervisor. So a lot of this is pretty much common sense, and probably a lot of farms are doing a lot of this already, but it's just a cognizant realization that they're doing it and that they have these topics that people are trained on, employees are trained on, and then it's documented. So if you have a crew that sticks around for more than a year or employees that stick around for more than a year, remember you need to at least once annually do the training with them and do a refresher training of the topics and have them sign and date that they got trained after a year after they were trained initially. Okay, so one other component to FSMA worker training requirements is that FSMA requires at least one responsible party or supervisor on the farm to attend an FDA-approved training. Currently, there's only one approved training, and that's offered by the Produce Safety Alliance, often referred to as PSA, and collaborating organizations around the country. Most likely, there's a fee to take this training, and at the hyperlink listed there is where the one webpage on the internet that lists all of these courses around the world. There's a lot domestically, but then there's also a lot of these courses offered internationally because any farm importing product to the US, their growers need to follow these same requirements. And that date's a little bit older now, but as of 10/3, there were 9 PSA grower trainings scheduled in California this winter, and CCOF will be offering 5 PSA trainings in 2018. So those will be additional ones added to that. CAFF as well will be offering a PSA training as a pre-conference option at the EcoFarm conference in January. in 2018, and then others later in 2018 as well. And then it's important to note that right now, farms are required to have this training done, and you'll see if you go to this link here and where all the trainings are listed that there's a wide range of prices that these trainings are offered. Some are offered for $0 and some are offered for hundreds of dollars. The FDA has released funding to the states, and states are doling it out to different organizations to provide these trainings at a reduced cost for growers, since this is already a time commitment for a grower to go to an 8-hour training, and they might have to drive a little distance to get there. So they're trying to make these trainings minimally priced, but that's not always the case. So if you're working with any growers, or if there's any growers on the line, shop around, because you might, there's a range of prices, and right now these are courses that are being subsidized for some people that offer them, and those are probably the ones that are the cheapest. So keep an eye out for that and take advantage of this opportunity while it's still available. And then just one other note about how at least one responsible party or supervisor from the farm must attend this training. This training certificate that is issued after you go to the training is attached to the person. So if you have an employee from your farm go to this training, and then an employee leaves your farm and goes to another farm, the fulfillment of this FSMA requirement is lost if you don't have anyone else at your farm that has gone to this course and has their certificate on staff. So it's important that you make sure, I would suggest if farms have the option to have 2 or 3 people potentially go to this training, because that would make sure if someone leaves that the farm doesn't all of a sudden lose this training and the requirement that they need to meet. And it also will help the farm implement the different practices if you have more than one person go, because more than one person will hear about all these details and can come back to the rest of the farm team and relay the information they learn, and it's not just all on one person that way. So, and we'll talk about this in the record keeping section later, but like I said, you get this certificate issued to you after you complete the full training, and that's a paper copy and electronic version that you need to make sure to keep on file if you are ever inspected. That will definitely be something that the FSMA inspectors will want to see that you have. So this is a little visual to recap what I just talked about. So you need to have at least one supervisor or responsible party go to this PSA training, and then they would come back to the farm and make sure that all the employees at the farm are trained on the applicable topics to them, and then you would have a record of each employee being trained along with your certificate from going to the training. So that's kind of the general overview of how that would work. Okay, so I've been talking to you for long enough. I'm going to hand the mic over to Dave.
Okay, so yeah, so the worker training, there's a long list of things that FSMA requires workers to do or not do, and so we haven't included all that here, but we have that in a fact sheet, and you can look at that, and it's of course also in the PSA materials. So I'm going to talk about worker health and hygiene, which is the second category that fully subject farms have to comply with. So one of the things that FSMA requires is preventing sick workers from contaminating produce. There's various ways that produce can get contaminated. It can get contaminated by water, it can get contaminated by animals, but it certainly can get contaminated from workers. And so FSMA basically says that if a worker is sick, they need to be excluded from any task or any area where they might contaminate produce. So they shouldn't be harvesting produce, they shouldn't be touching contact surfaces that might touch produce. So they don't necessarily have to go home, but sending them home might be a good policy. But the farm should definitely have a policy about this and make it very clear to the workers. Of course, we know that farm workers want to work and that they're going to be reluctant not to work. So the farm has to figure out a policy that's fair to the workers, but also keeps them away from contaminating produce. And one of the things that workers are supposed to be trained is basically to tell their supervisors if they are sick. And so sick in this case, means quite sick, so that the person has a fever or, they're throwing up or, that they have really key kinds of evidence, a lot of coughing. So anyway, this is one important way that produce for FSMA would be kept safe. The second requirement for worker health and safety is, here I do have the list of these hygiene practices. So yeah, so these are all things that the workers are supposed to be aware of, right? Maintain personal cleanliness. Well, that's a pretty subjective thing. I've heard some farmers talk about, so now I'm supposed to tell my workers to go take a shower or something. So, so that's an interesting one. Avoid contact with non-working animals while working on produce, and minimize contamination from working animals. And so the Amish and some other groups, have been working with FDA to try to figure out, what's the best way to minimize contamination from horses in fields and that kind of thing. So there will be, information about that available. And then if you're using gloves, make sure that they're cleaned or that you use new ones. It's not required to use gloves under FSMA. You can wash your hands perfectly well. But if your policy is to use gloves, then they have to be clean. Remove or cover hand jewelry. And so again, if you use gloves, that would satisfy that. Do not eat, chew gum, or use tobacco in produce areas. Typically food safety plans of farms designate an area for people to eat, or various areas for people to eat or smoke if smoking is allowed, but definitely away from areas where they may contaminate produce. And then washing hands with soap and water, and drying hands with some kind of single-use item, which is usually a paper towel of some sort, or could be a fancy hand dryer or whatever, but it has to be something that's not just a regular towel that multiple people would use. And so the FSMA requires lots of hand washing before starting work, before putting on gloves, after using the toilet, upon returning to work after a break, after touching animals or manure, after eating or smoking. So it's just a lot of hand washing required by FSMA. And I think that would be something new to a lot of farms. And it's going to take a lot of education of workers to get them to actually do that. And so I know that some of the larger farm operations, they've gone out and assigned people to sit with binoculars and watch the workers and see if they actually do this kind of thing, and then, have another educational session over and over again to try to get people to do this. Because a lot of the people who are working in farm work these days from Mexico or Central America grew up in places where there isn't running water. And so, washing your hands is not a common thing that people grew up doing. So it requires a significant amount of education. And then finally, they need, as I said before, notify their supervisor if they're ill. Okay, so the third area is for visitors. So if you have visitors to the farm, usually they have to sign in somewhere. If you're being audited, the auditor is going to want to see that you come out and meet the visitor as they arrive and require them to sign in or something. And then you have to inform visitors what areas they can visit on the farm, and you know, question them if they're sick. Basically, they should be told ahead of time that if they're sick, they shouldn't come to the farm. And then explain these hygienic practices, you know, why they need to wash their hands, when they need to wash their hands, and where the hand washing stations are. And also, in addition to telling them to stay home if they're sick, you should also tell them to not bring their pets with them. So visitors, just as the workers, must have access to toilet and hand washing facilities. The workers' access is governed by the OSHA rules, and so the visitors similarly need to be told, you know, where they can access a toilet, and reminded that they need to wash their hands after using it. So a FSMA wash station, there's little rules about these things. It has to have water that is has 0 generic E. coli for 100 milliliters, isn't that what it is? And so it's the kind of water that you would use in post-harvest washing and that sort of thing. So you have to use clean water. The single-use paper towels or some electric hand dryer or some similar thing has to have liquid soap, has to have a water catchment for the water that's coming out that you're washing your hands with, and has to have a closed towel disposal. So you can see this picture over here. This is a sort of rudimentary hand washing station, which is perfectly adequate. It has the water in the blue jug. The water falls into this catchment, which is the white bucket, and then the orange closed towel disposal there. And then the paper towels are in that little tub underneath the blue thing. And you can see the liquid soap over on the right. So you can set up some simple thing like this and put them in different places around the farm that would allow the workers to wash their hands at the different moments when they need to. But hand sanitizer gels cannot be used as a replacement for washing hands with soap and water. You want to explain why that is?
Yeah, that's just because hand sanitizers don't kill viruses on your hands, and if they do kill bacteria, that's only on hands that don't have a bunch of cracks in them and crevices and soil that interferes with the effectiveness of the hand sanitizer. So often farmers' hands wouldn't be the best for effectiveness with hand sanitizers.
Okay, so yeah, and so there's a lot of discussion about the correct way to wash hands. You can investigate that, but basically you have to keep washing your hands while you sing Happy Birthday to You twice. And so I've never done that in my life. So it's quite an ambitious thing to get people to wash their hands that thoroughly, but that's the idea. Finally, I think this is the last one. Toilet facilities must be readily accessible on all parts of the farm, right? So these are the OSHA rules, and they vary from state to state. But for FSMA, for the Federal Food Safety Act, the toilet facilities cannot be seen to contaminate any part of the farm. They have to be cleaned regularly. They have to provide for sanitary disposal of the waste and the toilet paper, and there has to be a hand washing station close by to the toilet. So for instance, if some inspector came out and saw that the toilet facility was overflowing and leaking onto the farm, that would be considered an egregious violation, and you would be reported to FDA, and then all kinds of bad things would happen. So it's important that these toilet facilities be cleaned regularly and not be totally full. Because I've been on a number of farms where there's the toilets, but you try to go in them and then the supervisor waves you off and says, oh no, don't go in that, right? So because it hasn't been cleaned. So the sewage has to be disposed of through sewage septic systems, or in the case of porta potties, pumped out by a commercial service. Again, they cannot contaminate the farm. And leaks must be dealt with in a way that minimizes contamination of the farm. And then floods, earthquakes, you have to check the system, right? FSMA basically requires you to check your water system annually and probably check any kind of septic system or sewage system on your farm as well.
Thanks, Dave. So we wanted to pause here after we covered these two pretty weighty categories at the start, especially for organic folks that might not be as focused on these categories, and see if there were any questions. So Megan, how's that looking?
Yeah, so feel free to write in your questions and we'll read them out for Kaylee and Dave. We did have some people write in at the beginning letting us know where they are calling in from. So we have people from Hawaii, Charlotte, and Texas, and then there's a mix of people that have and have not attended the first webinar. So kind of a mixed crowd out there. So we do have one question is, what does FDA consider a visitor? Particularly for farms or farmers and farm employees that live on the farm site. So, you know, you have cousins or something come over.
Okay, Megan, thanks. So the first question was, what does FDA consider a visitor, especially for farmers that live on the farm site and have like a cousin come visit them, and maybe their cousin's not coming to do anything at all at the farm, but they're just coming to visit their cousin who lives at the edge of the farm in a house.
Well, I think a visitor, I mean, obviously, if it's somebody associated with the farm, it's not a visitor. Visitor would be anybody, you know, like school kids coming in a little trip, or a salesman coming, some kind of third-party auditor, you know, anybody basically coming to the farm that who's not usually at the farm. And so I think, you know, that's probably a discretionary thing where you can define it in your food safety plan. The reason to have a food safety plan is to write down these kinds of things and say, this is what we're going to do. And these are the people who are visitors. And so when these people come, we're going to meet them and we're going to tell them these things. Somebody who's there as a relative and is there frequently, knows where the bathrooms are, knows what they can and can't do. I don't think those people would be considered visitors.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we also had a question asking as to whether pit latrines would be allowed by FSMA.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, good question. Pit latrines. So the way it's worded in the actual text of the law left me wondering the same thing. And there's something called the Technical Advisory Network, or the TAN, T-A-N. The FDA has this electronic portal that you can submit questions about FSMA to. And if anyone is interested, yeah, you can Google FDA TAN and you'll find it, and you can submit questions to it yourself if you want. I submitted a question about this and cited specific parts of the law that mention the details that are required, as Dave mentioned, for septic or sewage not contaminating crops or farm area. And I asked them about this, and they essentially answered that it wasn't a definite no and it wasn't a definite yes. It was essentially just kind of rephrasing exactly what the law says about not having toilets in a location or in a system or created or done in a way that could contaminate growing areas or crops. So if somebody had, say, a composting toilet that had like a cement catchment basin, so it wasn't even exposed to the soil, you know, things were getting contained, and that was, you know, downhill from the growing area. The growing area was uphill, and it wasn't near any water bodies or rivers or anything like that, and it was in a pretty low risk area or situation. From my response that I got from the FDA, I interpreted that as that toilet wouldn't be necessarily banned, but this is an area that we're still waiting to hear more on.
Yeah,
And Dave wants to add to this a little bit.
Yeah, so you have to be clear that FSMA says no human waste used in any way, shape, or form in the produce production. So that's the basic thing that they start from, right? They're afraid of human waste, and so you have to be able to demonstrate that human waste on your farm, you know, is not and cannot contaminate the produce in any kind of way.
I don't know if Jacob, if you have anything to add on this point?
No, not on this point, but I was just going to chime in about with the focus on the hand washing and just how in fresh produce, there seems to be a lot of problems that kind of stem from hygiene at the harvesting and at the production level. And so I think that's why the food safety community in general just really repeats over and over the hand washing theme, because it seems to be a lot of like outbreaks can stem from poor hygiene at the harvesting level. So that's why they beat it they beat it into everyone's head to wash your hands and train people to do the same. So.
Great, thank you. That's good insight kind of as to where all of these regulations and rules come from. And we did get another question come in that's asking, is it enough to verbally inform visitors about hygiene procedures, or does there need to be evidence that they've been given this training, like a list with signatures?
Good question. So about visitors and knowing, are they informed about hygiene and where the toilet facilities are and where the hand washing is? I have heard folks that are associated with FSMA stuff mention that having signs posted for, restroom this way, and having hand washing areas visibly noticeable, if they're naturally tucked in a weird corner of where you wouldn't necessarily think to find them easily, then you would need to make sure you have signage posted and have people know that. But if they're pretty obvious and common sense where the toilets are, then you could say that, again, as Dave mentioned, in your food safety plan, you would say for our visitor policy, we don't require visitors to sign and date that they've been trained on or know where these things are, because our restroom is right, at the front of our packing house, and it's labeled and there's a big sign on it, and inside the restroom, next to the sink, we have a big sign posted that everyone, including visitors, needs to wash their hands after using the restroom. Then that could be how your farm approaches it, that you have signs and visible cues in place to achieve that. However, maybe other farms feel more comfortable with a different approach and want to make sure that they are sitting a visitor down or standing with the visitor for 30 seconds and explaining it. And when they sign in anyways, they just check that they were trained on where the bathrooms were and etc. That it could just be a box next to their name and they could just check it, that they heard that information. So hopefully that gets to the answer there.
Great, thanks. So I think we had one more question come in, and then we'll move on to the rest of the presentation, and we'll have more time for questions and answers at the end. So if you have more questions that come up during the second half of the presentation, feel free to write them in. So we had someone ask whether, as a distributor, is there other requirements than to demonstrate that your suppliers comply with FSMA? Are there any requirements that the supplier needs produce safety training? And are there approved courses in Mexico?
Okay, so questions about on the buyer side or the distributor side, what food safety requirements apply to you? So the short answer is yes. FSMA is a full industry or food chain law that affects all parts of the supply chain. So there is the grower part of this called the produce rule, which is what these webinars talk about. But if you are a buyer, you are likely subject to the preventative controls rule, which is a different part of the FSMA regulation and not what we're covering in these webinars. There is a required training similar to how the growers are required to do the training for the PSA training that I mentioned. For the preventative controls rule, you need to go to what's called a PCQI training, and I forget exactly what the Preventative Controls Qualified Individual is what that acronym stands for, training. And that is provided by a different system than we mentioned earlier about the PSA information. So if you have questions on that, I would recommend that you can email myself after this webinar, and I can jump on a call with you. I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. And the second part of that question was what? It was
wondering whether there are approved courses in Mexico, and then also, are there any requirements to be a produce safety trainer?
So are there any courses in Mexico? I'm guessing that's what they mean for on the buyer level, not necessarily the grower level. I don't know on the buyer level. I assume yes. I don't know for sure off the top of my head. On the grower level for the PSA course, yes, there are grower level courses in Mexico. And then what is required for people giving these trainings? They need to have a pretty thorough background of experiences and specific training in school or field training in labs, and then they also have to go to a specific training course and then take a written exam afterwards and potentially have a verbal interview as well. So there's a pretty strong vetting process that goes into who is allowed to teach these courses.
Great, thanks. So yeah, we'll move on to the next half of the presentation, but if anybody has any other questions, feel free to write them in at any time, and we'll loop back around at the end of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Megan. So now we're on to buildings, equipment, tools, and sanitation, and I'm going to talk about that before Dave talks about harvest. So with your buildings and tools and equipment under FSMA, we already covered some of this with the toilet and hand washing requirements. There's a lot of kind of cross overlap here. And then also, you must use equipment and tools of adequate design and store them properly and maintain and when necessary, sanitize them. So this can mean a lot of different things. There's a lot of words that can be interpreted a lot of different ways in these requirements. When, what is necessary, when is it necessary, what is of adequate design. In general, if you're buying let's say a bulk root washer and you're washing carrots in it, then you're using a tool of adequate design. It's something that's marketed as a root washer and you're using it to wash roots, you're clearly meeting what the requirement says. However, similar to this next point here, if the seams on food contact surfaces must be smoothly bonded. I know a lot of farmers out there like to do some post-manufacturing additions or edits to tools that they come across and do some welding on their own and make changes. So they need to make sure that the seams, when they do that, are smoothly bonded. Cracks in welding joints or corners where things were welded are notorious areas for pathogens to be, and for where food gets contaminated. It's a really high likelihood of that. So that's just an important part with equipment. If you're using any thermometers or pH meters, say you have wash water that you dunk lettuce into and you put a diluted chlorine solution into that water, you are most likely or hopefully using pH meters or strips to test the pH of that water, because it needs to remain within a certain range for the chlorine to be effective. And you would, under FSMA, also need to make sure you're properly using the pH meter and it's calibrated correctly, and etc. So you need to make sure about that.
Talk about the temperature difference.
And then also for thermometers, those are important if you have any walk-in coolers and you want to make sure that you know, they're maintaining certain safe temperatures. There are some thermometers out there that I know some farms use that have wireless electronic, like they send a text to your phone if your thermometer goes below a certain low threshold or above a certain high threshold. You can set a min and a max temperature, and you get a text or an email if that changes, which some farmers find really useful to be kind of like a hands-off approach, but know if something happens to their cooler in a 100-degree day, they know that it happened a few minutes after something happens, not when they walk in the next day and find everything spoiled. And then also thermometers are useful in your wash water. Like I mentioned with the chlorine example, it's important that the water remains within a certain range for the chlorine to be effective. And you would need to be monitoring that if you're using a product, a sanitizer product in the water. And so another thing is if you're, say you're dunking cantaloupes into a tank of cold water and the cantaloupes were just harvested from a hot field and, you know, they might have an internal temperature of 105 degrees and you dunk them into 60-degree water, that stem where the cantaloupe was cut from or was harvested from will create a vacuum in the hot internal temperature with the cold external temperature, and it actually sucks in water from your dunk tank into the flesh of the cantaloupe. And there's been studies that have shown that cantaloupe and tomatoes and apples and mangoes are particularly susceptible to this, and this is called infiltration. And so if those crops are dunked in water that is contaminated, all of a sudden that contaminated water gets sucked into the inside flesh of the product, and then these are all things that people eat raw and they just slice open and eat, and unfortunately can get really sick from. So that's just a little bit about how post-harvest area and just different equipment that you really need to consider. So then, yes, and buildings must provide suitable conditions and drainage to reduce contamination of produce. FSMA doesn't require that farms have, you know, roofed buildings that are fully enclosed with concrete floors or anything like that. But if a farm does, they need to make sure those have suitable conditions and they don't have a bunch of water and cull produce on the floor. You know, there needs to be appropriate cleaning and drainage around. And then farms must take reasonable measures to prevent contamination by domesticated animals in fully enclosed buildings. So here is one specific that the law notes, which is essentially you shouldn't let domesticated animals into your enclosed buildings that you have food stored in. If, as Dave mentioned earlier, service animals are one exception to this, but you would need to have some sort of policy in place that you would check to make sure the service dog didn't defecate anywhere after it was in the building, some things like that. Okay, and then also for pest control in your buildings, if you're in a fully enclosed building, you must take measures to exclude pests. If you're in a partially enclosed building, so you just have maybe a lean-to or something on the side of a building, you obviously can't prevent pests from getting into there because it's not closed, but you could do measures to prevent them. So like if there's a ceiling of that lean-to that is angled in a way where birds could get up in there and perch in there, a measure you could take to prevent them is you could put a bird net up across the top of that ceiling so that birds can't get up into there. That would be an example of something that you could do in a partially enclosed building to help discourage pests from becoming established. Again, some more common sense things. Trash must be disposed of and don't let it contaminate produce, so have, you know, clearly marked trash containers. And then plumbing requirements, if you have a water system, if you're like washing produce post-harvest, you need to make sure that you're doing it properly and you dispose of the liquid and that you're not contaminating water. So that's just important to keep in mind. And then I'll just pause there and see if, I don't know if Jacob, you want to add anything in particular about water, and I know organic regulations have different requirements for if you're using sanitizers and such.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sometimes this is where food safety and organic can get confused, where producers who have a post-harvest process think that they need to sanitize all their equipment, which that's a good idea to do, but they maybe purchase like a quaternary ammonia heavy-duty sanitizer, and thinking that they need to do this to be in alignment with food safety. But then the organic inspector shows up and they see this quaternary ammonium product and asks how they're being used, and if they're not rinsing and testing that food contact surface for residues of that quaternary ammonium, then they're in non-compliance with their organic certification. So I've seen that happen a few times. So it's important to really to run any kind of products or materials you're using across your organic certifier, and making sure that you're using those materials in compliance with the organic rules.
Great, Jacob, thank you. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Dave to talk about harvest.
Yeah, so on the what Kaylee was talking about, I think probably the number one thing if you're just starting on food safety is clean up the farm. Make sure there aren't piles of trash around the farm. That'll go a long way to keeping some inspector from thinking that you're not doing anything. I know that's hard, but there you go. Okay, harvest. Take all measures reasonably necessary to identify and not harvest produce that is reasonably likely to be contaminated. So probably the number one way it might be contaminated would be from feces from some animal or bird. And so again, here's a reason to have a food safety plan. In your food safety plan, you would write down what your policy is. If a worker finds this, or you find it, what are you going to do? So the most common thing is to mark off an area around it, by examining the area. And, that could be small or it could be large. I mean, depending on your policy, what you decide, depending on who you're selling to. Because the people you're selling to might have their own policy that you need to follow. But you cannot harvest produce that has feces on it, period. You can't wipe it off or anything like that. It just has to be not harvested. And so the workers have to be well educated in this, all the people who are going to harvest. Another thing that, a flood could, of some sort, could contaminate stuff, and so you couldn't harvest that. There's a number of different ways that things could potentially be contaminated. And so again, it's important to think these through and write down some policy that you're going to have anytime that you encounter it. Handle harvested produce to minimize contact of cut produce surfaces with soil. So for instance, if you're harvesting lettuce and you're cutting off the outside leaves, you'd have to educate the workers to be very careful that they don't have the lettuce touch the ground after they harvest it. And this goes along with the next one, do not harvest drop produce. So there's a famous case, the Odwalla apple juice case, right, where people harvested windfall apples. They got into the apple juice. The apple juice was not pasteurized, and a lot of people got sick and died. So you can certainly pasteurize apple juice, which Odwalla then started to do, but the FDA has decided that no produce that has dropped on the ground from a tree or from somebody harvesting and accidentally drops it cannot be picked up and marketed. And so that is something that workers have to be very clearly educated about. Food packaging materials must be unlikely to support the growth of bacteria either by being new or cleaned adequately. So, you know, you can use a new box, right? That's basically a clean thing. If you're going to use some box that's already been used, like these wax paper boxes that are used in CSAs, they have to be cleaned. So a lot of CSAs have shifted to plastic boxes, which are a lot easier to clean. Just have to make sure that you can get them back from your customers, as they're a lot more costly. And so I see over here it says NOP, you have to track the amount of harvested product from each crop. That's a different aspect of FSMA. Requires traceability, and FDA has not issued, you know, the actual requirements for that yet. But basically, you have a responsibility. Do we have that further on here? You have a responsibility to track one up, one back. So you have to keep records that show anything that you buy and anything and who you sell everything to. So anyway, I don't know that we have a thing about that. So, but here's record keeping. Maybe you have it in there.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so to move on to record keeping, here is a good place to explain that. I'm going to talk about record keeping now, but it's only going to be record keeping requirements of the categories we covered today. So it's not the full exhaustive list of all of the record keeping farms are required to do under FSMA, just the categories we've covered today. So for personnel training, and hopefully this will be a recap going over this because we mentioned it earlier in our discussions of these topics. But for personnel training, you need to have the record of the training that includes the date of the training, the topics covered, and the name and the signature of the trainee. And then this column here on the right is where some of the records under FSMA are required to be reviewed and signed by a supervisor. And I have the asterisks there because if it's a small farm and the owner has maybe 2 employees, or maybe it's just themselves, and they're the only one, there is theoretically a scenario where the owner would do a training for themselves, review the details, sign that they did the training and date it, but then they have no supervisor to themselves, so they would not need to sign and date the same record a second time. But in other operations, there might be more hierarchy, and if you have crew foremen that are required, that you decide you want them to do the training for the crews they work with for harvesting, and they keep the records themselves. In that situation, somebody who is above the crew foreman would need to, as soon as reasonably like at a reasonable frequency, go in and check that crew foreman's records to make sure that he's been updating the records and actively keeping the records of the training. And then at that time of checking the record, the supervisor would sign and date it too. So there's an extra level of of record keeping and review that is built into this for some of the records. Then for personnel training, you also, as we mentioned, need to have at least one employee do that PSA training and get their certificate, which you would keep on file at the farm in case you were inspected, and that does not need to be reviewed by a supervisor. Then you would also have your building and your tools and equipment records, and so mainly this is a record of cleaning and sanitizing if necessary, equipment used in harvesting, packing, or holding activities. And then also having your toilet cleaning records. So if you outsource latrines or porta potty service to a company, they often just put the date of cleaning the unit inside the door of each unit. So that is something that needs to be kept track of. So if you do your bathroom cleaning in-house, you would need to create a cleaning record for that bathroom if you don't already have one. And as this states, these records would need to be reviewed and signed by a supervisor. So here in that porta potty example, this is actually an important check that's put in place, because say you do outsource your porta potty cleaning and they're supposed to be coming and cleaning it every week, and that they are supposed to keep the record in there, and then say once a month or at some frequency you have a supervisor on the farm go check the toilets to make sure that there's actively being cleaned as the law requires here for that to happen, and that supervisor sees that, oh, something's wrong, like they're not cleaning them, we don't have records that they came the last 2 weeks, then that would be a system that's put in place that helps keep a check on that, because toilets and hand washing are such serious areas of the farm as far as where contamination happens, that it's really important that those areas are maintained appropriately. And maybe I'm thinking as I say this here, I don't know if Jacob, what is exactly for the cleaning records for organic regulations are required? Is that something that could fulfill both requirements?
Usually with equipment, there's cleaning requirements if it's shared equipment, meaning that the equipment is also used for non-organic aspects of the operation. So that's when you really see kind of equipment cleaning rising to an organic compliance level, not necessarily for food safety contamination issues. So.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I remember seeing something about equipment cleaning on an OSP form somewhere, and that makes total sense that it's not for food safety. It's mainly for commingling if equipment's used back and forth between organic and non-organic operations. So there's a little bit of difference there that organic farms would need to recognize if they haven't been doing food safety stuff before, that this is getting at more than just making sure that you're not contaminating organic crops.
But I will say that it's pretty common that if there's equipment being used on the farm, that there are cleaning records just to keep the equipment in good repair. And for the organic and non-organic crossover. So just usually if there's equipment, it's usually being cleaned, and usually there's a record of that on an organic farm, and a lot of times that can transfer over to the FSMA requirements. So.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. Okay, and then under harvest, record keeping requirements that you can prove with your documentation or record keeping how your crop, you can look one step backward and one step forward for that crop. So a farm knows that their strawberries came from X location on the farm, and then they went to X buyer. And so this can be done so many different ways, from small little farms doing it with just their handwritten record keeping systems to different operations that have barcodes that track where things move around and where they came from. The law doesn't require a specific type of record keeping system for this. This was actually something that was fought for, and that it wasn't required to have an electronic record keeping system for traceability, that farmers could still use handwritten systems. And this, again, here, as it says there, this record does not need to be reviewed and signed by a supervisor.
So Kaylee, we had a clarifying question come in about the water used for cleaning and sanitizing, and someone was wondering, should the water used for cleaning be tested to be absent for generic E. coli?
Good question, yeah, about cleaning water and whether it should be tested for absence of generic E. coli. I think, well, I know that, as we've mentioned, the water details are still getting finalized and are being re-reviewed. As the water regulation part of this stands right now, you would, yes, the water you're using for for activities involved in harvest or equipment involved in harvest or post-harvest would need to be done with potable water and water that doesn't have a presence of generic E. coli. I doubt that that part of the water rule will change in the future. So that is something that, so yeah, to get at that answer to that, there's a lot more involved in there, and we will go deep into that topic in the January webinar.
Okay, great, thanks. I think that's all the clarifying questions we have right now, so feel free to move forward.
Okay, thanks. I don't think we have too many slides left, but this next one here is just an example of record keeping and food safety plan templates. On CAFF's website here, we have a lot of Word documents, and a number of them are available in Spanish as well, so farms can go on and download the Word document and delete sections of it that don't apply to them or add things that apply to them. And here is an example of the visitors policy and log sheet that we have up there on the website. So a farm can just fill this out and adapt it to their situation. And kind of at our question earlier, this would get at, you want to have people sign in when they get to the farm anyways, and at the top of this sign-in sheet, they have this little list here of that covers the topics they need to be trained on. So right there, you kind of kill two birds with one stone. So that's an example of how you could fulfill that. And these are just, there's tons of resources out there. This is just giving you an example. And a few other notes on record keeping. An existing record, if it already exists for organic or some other record you're keeping on the farm, and it has all the details that you need for food safety, you don't need to keep two duplicated records. You can have one record that you pull out of your OSP to prove food safety stuff, as long as it has the necessary information. And along those lines, if you are inspected by FDA or your state Department of Agriculture, you will be required to provide these legible records within 24 hours of when the inspection is. You can store the records on-site or off-site, again, as long as you can get them available within 24 hours. And in general, it's best with the food safety requirements to make sure to keep them for at least 2 years after their creation. And then keep the originals, true copies, or electronic records. So you can have some of your records as electronic records and then some as handwritten, and cover all your bases that way. So just a little bit of concluding thoughts here. So some key points: FSMA does not require a farm to do anything that would contradict with NOP rules and regulations. That's a really important point to drive home, because we don't want growers to feel trapped that they are trying to fulfill their organic regulations and that all of a sudden they need to do some practices, or they think they need to do some practices that would jeopardize organic requirements, and that's not the case. So fully covered organic farms will need to document worker training and make sure they are in compliance with the FSMA health and hygiene requirements, and then they also need to have someone attend the PSA training. And again, we will cover some of these more hot topics of the water and the manure, compost, different soil amendments in the next webinar. For now, farms can use the NOP interval of the 90 or 120 days from time of application of manure to harvest. Right now, that's kind of what the FDA is, not kind of, that is what the FDA has settled on for what farms can do, while the next 5 to 10 years, the FDA is doing more research to determine what the day window will be under the Food Safety Modernization Act for when you can apply manures before harvest. So, do you want to say more on that?
Yeah, so just as a prelude, so the FDA initially proposed 1 year as the time interval. And so people fought back and said that's too long, wouldn't work for organic growers. So then they proposed 9 months, and same thing. And so they started funding research around the country. So, for instance, here at UC Davis, there's a whole research underway in the veterinary school to determine how long the pathogens survive from manure in different farms. And obviously it depends on soil and temperature and what kind of manure it is and a whole series of things. So that's the research that's underway. And the FDA has just said that in the interim, they won't object if you follow the NOP rules, 90 days for application that won't touch the harvestable portion of the crop, and 120 days for an application that would touch the harvestable portion of the crop. So.
Thanks, Dave, for expanding upon that. Okay, so yeah, oops. So that brings us to kind of our next question. We're done with the formal presentation. Megan, is there any other questions that came in?
Yeah, we did have another question that came in, kind of talking about facilities again in FSMA. So kind of there's a scenario where there's a pack house that's located on a different location from the farms it services, and it's under different management, and it's packing mangoes from 5 different growers. Does the produce safety rule, is it applicable only for growers, or would it impact the pack house? And what rule would be applicable for the pack house?
Yeah, there's a lot of detail there. The first response is that that pack house is considered a facility, so it would be subject to the preventative controls rule, or often called the PC rule, that I mentioned earlier. So if it was explained there that the pack house is aggregating from 5 different growers, but the pack house is not owned by any of those growers and is under different management, then that pack house would not be considered part of a farm or a farm. It's considered a facility. There are scenarios where, if, say, hypothetically, or say in a different example, that pack house was 60% owned by the farmers that sell mangoes to it, then that pack house would be viewed as an extension of those farms and be considered a farm, as long as the farmers that sold the majority of the product that moved through that pack house owned a majority of that pack house. So it doesn't sound like that's the case in that scenario, but I would encourage that person asking to get a hold of people and talk more in depth about the specifics of your scenario, because there's a lot of technical details rolled up into all of this. So from the minimal I know, that'd be my response.
Great, thanks. And if people have these kind of detailed questions about their operations, who would be good people for them to follow up with?
Well, on the grower side, for growers, definitely I'm available. This is a main part of my job, is to answer phone calls and emails and talk to farmers about all these details. I do work with some buyers as well. It depends on where you're located in the country. If each state, some of the state Department of Agricultures are enforcing FSMA, so they are creating new FSMA inspection teams and people there. So depending upon where you're located, you could reach out to those folks. So sorry that's not specific, but I do know we have a wide audience here from different parts of the US, and I'm just based in California. So you could start by trying to get some contacts with your Department of Agriculture or other nonprofit groups in your area if you know about them. And then land-grant universities and extension specialists that work with extension, and they often they wear a lot of hats, but they often know about food safety stuff.
Great, thanks.
Kaylee, this is Jacob, and I'd be available to take an email. It's just Jacob, Jacob, @ccof.org. And if I can give you an answer, I can help direct you to somebody that can.
Great, yeah, and we'll also send out Kaylee and Jacob's emails in a follow-up email after the webinar, so you'll have all of that information. So I think that's all the time we have today. Again, if you have any additional questions that we weren't able to answer, please follow up with Kaylee or Jacob, or send them to me and I'll field them to the best person. And just thanks again to Kaylee, Dave, and Jacob for taking time to be with us here this afternoon and sharing all of your expertise. There's a lot of really good details that were shared today, and even more information to come in January. I did want to highlight a couple resources. Kaylee mentioned a number in her presentation, as did Dave, but just to have it for easy reference, the CAFF food safety web pages have all of the templates they were talking about, as well as a lot of other good resources. I know there's a number of people on the webinar today who didn't attend the first webinar, so if you're kind of confused about how FSMA impacts your farm or the growers that you work with, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition has a really good flow chart that kind of helps growers figure out where they fall in FSMA and what their requirements might be. And if you're really curious and want to read the text of the law, it's there for you to peruse. We included that link as well. And the CCOF website has great information on organic certification as well as food safety. And we have a weekly newsletter that sends out updates for organic producers, including our food safety training. The Family Farmed on-farm food safety project is also a really good resource for food safety, particularly for growers who might not have had to think about food safety before and are kind of getting started. It's sort of like a TurboTax for food safety plans that kind of ask you questions and you go through and it helps you put that together. So that's a good resource. And then Wild Farm Alliance has a great number of resources on managing food safety and conservation. And in our webinar in January, Joanne Baumgartner, who's the Executive Director of Wild Farm Alliance, will be here to kind of share her expertise in that area. Which is a good segue to our upcoming events. We have the Food Safety and Organic webinar coming up in January. And as Kaylee mentioned, CCOF as well as CAFF will be putting on a number of the PSA food safety trainings for farms that are required to have that training as part of FSMA. And then if you're interested in topics other than food safety, we have a tour of the San Francisco wholesale produce market coming up at the end of the month, as well as a webinar on organic value-added processing for growers. So that's kind of how to add, if you want to certify your salsa as organic, what you need to do that. And then looking ahead in February, we have the annual CCOF annual meeting and conference in Sacramento. And we also wanted to recognize that it's been a pretty difficult year this year in terms of natural disasters. There's been all the wildfires in California, as well as numerous hurricanes. And CCOF has a hardship assistance fund for organic producers who have suffered losses due to extreme hardship. So if you know of an organic producer that has suffered losses, or you are one that was impacted by some of those natural disasters, the deadline for applications is coming up in December, and we would love to have you submit one. So thanks again for attending today. We hope you found the information useful, and please fill out your evaluation form. If you want to receive continuing education units for this webinar, please include your full name, and if you're a certified crop advisor, also your CCA identification number in the evaluation form. And again, thanks for being with us here today, and have a good afternoon.